take what I say about radiometric dating, you should take it with the understanding that it's coming from someone who looks at it at a secondary level, and the same would be true for Kent, that in effect you're listening to two charlatans talking about an aspect of science that neither of us knows in sufficient detail to really be talking about it like this. That point. I want to return in the few minutes I have left. We keep wandering away from my efforts to find something within the book of Genesis that would lead to a testable prediction. And what I'm thinking is, and I hope I'm not beating a dead horse or a dead dinosaur, so to speak, but I want to return to this idea of what a kind is, because again, if we could determine what that is, and if we are willing to concede that microevolution occurs, which would allow some diversification within kinds, we could actually do a survey of the animal or plant kingdoms, or the bacterial kingdoms for that matter, and we could determine whether the genetic diversity between kinds, between species, within species, was consistent with the prediction that we derive from the Genesis hypothesis, and therefore we could test it. So I have to return to this. And before I do, if you'll just hold that thought and try to respond to that. Another test that comes to mind concerns genetic diversity. There's a well-known phenomenon in population genetics and evolutionary biology that when a population is reduced to a small size, that much of the genetic variation in the population is lost. And this is thought to be the explanation of the very low genetic diversity among cheetahs, and you can do experiments in the laboratory with Drosophila that demonstrate this very clearly. It is the case, and Genesis is fairly clear about this, that in the flood of Noah, that species pairs were put on the ark 2 by 2. Actually, there's a distinction between clean animals and unclean animals, and I'm not sure what that is, but unclean animals were brought on 2 by 2, and yes, clean animals, I think in pairs of 7 or 6 or something. I don't remember exactly. And that with regard to the human population or human sample on the ark, there was Noah and his wife, his 3 sons and their wives. Now, this is a population bottleneck, which according to the Genesis hypothesis occurred 4,000 years ago. And among other things, it would mean that there was only a single Y chromosome, that is Noah's male sex-determining chromosome. And I haven't done the calculations exactly, but we could. I mean, we could actually test this hypothesis. We could calculate how much genetic diversity there should be in modern populations, applying the uniformitarian principle of science, which I claim is essential if you're doing science, which would be to base it on mutation rates that we measure in the laboratory. And we could calculate what the genetic diversity of human populations ought to be. And where we want to look first, as I said, is at the Y chromosome, then the mitochondrial genome, because it's transmitted only through the females. We'd have even a smaller bottleneck there. And then we would want to look at the nuclear genes. But I claim, without having the data in hand, that the genetic diversity in human populations vastly exceeds a bottleneck of that sort. If we had really gone through the Noachian bottleneck, then heart transplants would not be near the problem they are today. The problem with all tissue transplants, heart transplants, liver transplants, has to do with the enormous diversity of the major histocompatibility genes. There are more histocompatibility alleles than it seems plausible could have come through that bottleneck. And not only that, there are histocompatibility genes within humans that are more similar to histocompatibility genes within gorillas than they are to other histocompatibility genes in humans. There's this enormous diversity, and I don't understand how that could have come through the bottleneck of that size. So I want you to address the problem of defining kinds such that we can look at how genetic diversity ought to be partitioned between kind species and within species, and then address this problem of the seemingly excessive genetic variation.
Okay, I'd be glad to do that. We've got quite a few questions have come in, right?
Yeah, if you don't mind, we appreciate all that you all have done, and we all enjoyed it very much. Like, maybe we give them all a big hand. If you would take just a moment, Dr. Hoven, to respond, and then I have a few questions from the audience. What I would ask in advance is, in an effort to get some questions through, if you could keep your responses, both of you, down to about 3 minutes so we can get a few questions through. I'd certainly appreciate it. And for the audience, we'd appreciate it if you'd hold your response until the end to give us optimal time for these questions. Thank you.
Okay, you asked what is a kind. I've told you several times I don't know for sure. If I had to pick something, I would say it's closer to our current divisions of family as opposed to species. You've never given a definition of species, and you made a big deal about making predictions, yet the evolutionists do not make predictions. I will give you some predictions based on the Genesis account. I would predict that because of this worldwide flood, we should find lots of fossils all over the world, zillions of them, things that are dead. We should find layers of coal and natural gas and oil from the plants and animals that were buried in this flood. We should find sedimentary rock over most of the earth. We should find fossil seashells on top of major mountain ranges all over the world. That's a prediction, which obviously is true. I mean, everybody knows, that's the way it is. So I think that's a reasonable prediction from Genesis. You mentioned about Noah taking species on the ark. I didn't use the word species, and he didn't use the word species, and God didn't use the word species. God says 2 of every sort and 2 of every kind. Sorts and kinds are the only words used to describe these animals. So your whole effort seems to be to try to box somebody into a corner to make a definition of kind when you're not willing to do that on species. And then if somebody did make a definition of kind, like I said, okay, if I had to, I would say probably more like a family, you will then devote enormous amounts of research to determine how that could be wrong, and yet you won't devote the same amount of research to study how your idea could be wrong of evolution. It's very one-sided here. It seems to be more anti-creation than it is pro-science. I would point out, as far as the bottleneck of coming through Noah's family at the flood, all of us coming from a rock is an enormous bottleneck, which is what the evolutionist ultimately believes. We all came from a single common ancestor. You talk about a bottleneck, that's just simply not possible. You mentioned about the carbon dating. You may be aware that when Richard Leakey found the skull, KNM ER 1470, found 1972, it looked like modern humans, but it was found under the KBS tuft. Now, the KBS tuft had already been dated by potassium argon dating from Nature magazine, April 18, 1970, page 226. It had been dated at 212 million years old. This date had been verified several different ways. Everybody accepted the date of the KBS tuft at 212 million years old until they found the human skull underneath. The only way they knew the potassium argon date was wrong was the fossils didn't match the theory. So evolution assumption was